When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am sitting across from somebody who has been on the show many times, Dr. Linda Porter. Linda, welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm pleased to be talking to you in person.
In person, yes. After all of these finally.
Yeah.
When you've been on the show, we've talked about all different kinds of people.
Yeah.
Especially Catherine Parr, who is one of my favorites. I think we've talked about Mary the First.
Yes, we have. I'm trying to remember who else we've... we talked about the Queens of James V in Scotland.
Yes, we did.
Yes, that was probably the most recent one.
That was. That was a really fun one, too. I think I re-aired that one recently as well because it was so good.
Oh, great. Yeah, well, it's a fun topic. And, of course, related in some respect to what we're going to talk about today, since James V was the only surviving child of Margaret Tudor and James IV. But of course, in many respects, it's a bit like selling a house. You only need one to come and buy it, and you only need one son to survive. And he was the one that did.
Yes. So I guess we should lead into it then. You have a new book.
I do.
About Margaret Tudor called The Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor.
Right.
Now, this is one of the Tudors we don't hear much about, right?
It's true. And I think that was what perhaps first attracted me to her as a topic. And also that when she has been written about, it's been almost unfailingly patronizing, negative and dismissive. And yet she is a major Tudor figure and a major figure in British politics in the first half of the 16th century. And being constantly dismissed as the overweight, oversexed elder sister of Henry VIII, it is not only unjust to her, but also deprives people of knowing about an interesting and dramatic life.
You mentioned her, and the things you just said about her sound very familiar to Mary, Queen of Scots.
Yes, and in fact, I think there is a lot familiar in their lives. Mary, Queen of Scots was her granddaughter. Margaret didn't live long enough to know about her birth. Mary, Queen of Scots was born just over a year after Margaret's death. But in terms of drama and, personal affliction and ill health and those sort of aspects of people which we tend to overlook in the past, I think our view of the Tudors varies between the old-fashioned view that, Edward VI was sickly and that was all that you need to know about him, or that they're sort of robust and great and long-lasting like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Whereas, of course, this conceals as much as it reveals and isn't true anyhow. And Margaret has sort of fallen off people's interest in this respect. And as I said, when she has been written about, it has been on the basis of fragmentary research quite often, or a considerable amount of prejudice against a woman who, despite the odds that she faced, was extremely strong and survived. And it has to be said, of course, that unlike her granddaughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, Margaret Tudor died in her bed and died a natural death. And the other thing that I've said to people about her, when you look at her life and all of the various events and challenges that she faced, is that I don't think, to be honest, she was a tremendously likable woman necessarily. Well, she could be profoundly irritating, I think. And the fact that she never gave up on pursuing her own view of what should happen to her son in Scotland and how he should eventually come to rule in his own right. And the fact that she had to pursue so doggedly her own situations. She was always short of money. And that was because, she was deprived of rents. Her lands weren't properly managed. Her two subsequent husbands after James IV's death stole from her, essentially, and tried to dismiss her. But she wasn't a woman who actually hurt anybody, I don't think. Unlike Henry VIII,
Right.
her brother, who hurt a very great many people. And yes, I think Margaret could be very irritating. She obviously irritated the hell out of Henry VIII. And she was very convinced of her own rectitude about things, and also liable, as many of us are from time to time, to make the wrong judgment at crucial times. But none of this should disguise the fact that she was a born survivor, that she had quite considerable diplomatic skills, which have only just come to light via a very thorough examination of her letters. Because I think something else that isn't known at all about Margaret is that more of her letters survive than any of the other Tudor queens, and more than some of the other Tudor monarchs as well. So, I mean, it's a huge body of stuff, and there would be more probably. And some of it, of course, we'll never know how revealing it might have been. But during the Civil Wars, a ship carrying a lot of Scottish documents from Edinburgh down to London was shipwrecked. And so there's a whole massive body of evidence that was lost. So what we have of Margaret's letters are largely things that she wrote to English politicians. There aren't very many personal letters, though there are some, particularly from when she was very young. There is a great body of literature. And a linguistic scholar, Dr. Helen Newsome, looked at Margaret's correspondence for her doctoral thesis and found in this a very different woman from someone who was only interested supposedly in younger men and clothes and jewellery. And before we get to the younger men, it is worth mentioning that any queen in the 16th century, and possibly even nowadays, if you think of all the attention that is given to the Princess of Wales and what she's wearing, any queen who's not interested in clothes and jewellery is just really not going to cut it. It is a vital part of your image, and you have to address it accordingly. And if you think you're being shortchanged or you can't represent yourself in the way that you want, then it's not about you. It's about the role of a queen, basically.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that is inadequately appreciated about Margaret and her survival through all the twists and turns of the regency of her very young son is how she came to be in Scotland in the first place as a 13-year-old, when she married formally James IV, because she had a proxy marriage the year before, but when she married him in August of 1503, she was still 4 months short of her 14th birthday. Nowadays, this causes all kinds of horror and convulsion and everything, but while not exactly the norm for women of aristocratic birth, they did tend to marry young. Margaret was perhaps somewhat younger than most, so it's worth remembering that the mother-in-law she never knew, James IV's mother, Margaret of Denmark, had been married at the age of 12. And so was Isabella of France when she married Edward II of England. These are, while people get in a high dudgeon about this sort of thing, I'm always reminded of the fact that when I first visited my husband's home in Arkansas, the local newspaper had a big splash on it showing a 14-year-old recently married with her baby. This is not so long ago. And I believe I'm right in saying, Rebecca, though you may well correct me on this, that you can still marry at the age of 12 in some American states.
It's possible.
Yes.
So I think there are states where if you have parental consent.
Yes, okay. Yes. I mean, it was considered that if you had reached puberty, you were of marriageable age. And given the extraordinarily high infant mortality rates, particularly for monarchs who needed heirs, there wasn't much. I was going to say there wasn't much point in waiting around. That's not quite true because, of course, James IV, who was a man of immense charm but a notorious womanizer, he wasn't quite so bad after he married Margaret, but he didn't give up mistresses completely, did wait until she was 16 for her to become pregnant. There's often a lot of speculation about how these sort of things were managed, which we don't need to go into here. And we certainly don't know anything about their wedding night, other than the fact that one of the great things about Margaret Tudor and her early life and her marriage is that we've got this wonderful record of it by the Somerset Herald, John Young, who accompanied Margaret and the massive entourage that went up to Scotland with her in the summer of 1503. And he recorded all sorts of things about it, mostly about the displays and what people were wearing, which of course was his area of interest and is indeed the area of interest of many people who read my books. You know, they're not too interested necessarily in the minutiae of the regencies for the time from a constitutional point of view, but they do like to know how people looked and conducted themselves and what music they heard and entertainments and religious ceremonies and all that. So John Young is a wonderful source for that. And all he says about the wedding night of Margaret Tudor and James IV is that after, you know, various feasting and revels, the king had the queen apart and they went together. And that's all it says. It doesn't say anything more about, you know, bedding ceremonies or anything like that. But for those of a somewhat more prurient disposition, there must have been some kind of sexual activity, because otherwise the marriage could be annulled.
Right.
So, you know, you have to bear that in mind. But I mean, at least from Margaret's point of view, her husband was highly experienced. So
she learned that quickly.
Yes, she did. Yes. I mean, we don't know how much she knew about his background. These women like Margaret are often represented as being total innocents, but, you know, their ladies would have told them what to expect. Right. That's one of the roles of a lady in waiting, after all. And indeed, you know, she probably had picked up certain things about her husband's earlier life. And if she didn't know, she found out fairly soon, because she soon discovered that several of his illegitimate children were living in her dower castle of Stirling, and they were moved out fairly rapidly. We don't know whether this was as a result of a confrontation. Margaret had a temper, of course, as did many of the Tudors. Yes. Well, you'd probably have a temper if you were 13 years old and had discovered that your dower castle had several of your husband's illegitimate kids living in it. In fact, she got on very well with his illegitimate children, particularly his eldest illegitimate son, Alexander Stuart. She was a very good stepmother to him, and they obviously, you know, they knew each other well and played cards together in the evening and all that sort of thing. So she fitted very well into the role. There hadn't been a queen consort in Scotland for, let's think, James's mother died in about 1486, I think. So nearly 20 years, not quite that long, quite a long time. And all of James's ladies, who are referred to obliquely in the accounts from time to time as the lady, rather than actually named, he had some quite close relationships. In fact, his current mistress at the time that he married Margaret was Janet Kennedy, who was moved up to Darnaway Castle in the northeast of Scotland. She had been living in Stirling shortly before the actual marriage took place. She was pregnant with their third child at the time. Wow. And he did go to visit her once he had got Margaret settled in. And Margaret's initial beef, I think, was not so much with him, because he was what he was, and it wouldn't have taken her long to recognise that he was a remarkable man, highly charismatic, well-educated, determined to be a Renaissance prince on the European scene. And he did give her a decade of training as to how to be a queen consort and support him, something which must have been invaluable to her, I think, in the future. But her main concern when she got to Edinburgh was that the Earl of Surrey, who had been in charge of her entourage, travelling all the way up through England in what was one of the great progresses of the 16th century, because it happens in 1503, it's often overlooked, but it was a far greater progress than most of the ones made by Henry VIII or Elizabeth. It was Henry VII's way of ensuring that his dynasty was finally accepted, and the spectacle of it that he wanted through this very young girl. And so the pressure on her must have been enormous. And every time she entered a town, whether it was Durham or York or any of the other major cities, she had to have a complete change of clothing and makeup. It's a bit like being a modern celebrity.
Sure.
It's what they do, but most of them aren't 13. On the other hand, Margaret did have lots of ladies and supporters and all that around her, and one of the men in her entourage was a certain Sir Thomas Boleyn.
Wow. Well, that's an interesting.
It is, yes. I mean, even Nicola Tallis, who read the first draft of my book, I remember she wrote on it, "Wow, I didn't know this." So, yes, it is interesting how these people overlap each other, really. But Surrey had been, well, I suppose to call him bossy is to put it politely. He'd been absolute pain during the whole of this journey. He'd been, he saw it as his job to deliver this little lass up to Scotland and didn't very much care whether he was abrasive and offensive towards her. He had a duty to Henry VII. And so he was rude to Margaret, he was rude to her entourage. She kept on countermanding her commands, which was difficult for her, I think. And when she got to Scotland, she wrote really quite a heart-rending letter, and we are so lucky that these kind of letters survive because they are very few and far between. Much of it was dictated, in which she complained of Surrey's behaviour and saying he was monopolising time that she would like to get to know her husband, her new husband. And at the end of it, she wrote in her own handwriting, "I wish I were with your grace now and many times more." No more to your grace at this time, but she was obviously homesick, exhausted, and worried about the future that lay ahead. But she didn't need to be, because James, for all his womanizing, was a hugely supportive and indulgent husband. He showered this girl with jewels and furs, and of course she sat with him in the Scottish castles in the winter, done up in all of these furs and everything, listening to the poetry of the Macas, the Scottish poets, and the storytelling and everything. And all right, it wasn't an English court, and certainly wasn't able to compete with her brothers in the end. But it wasn't backward or barbarian, and it did look out to Europe in a way eventually that perhaps as Henry's life went on, his court didn't, because of course during the Reformation, Henry's dealings with Europe were so difficult that in a sense, although people like Holbein came over, his European contacts rather contracted. So Margaret was not in an uncivilized place. It was a small country with a small population, but James was determined to make it play its part in Europe, I would say.
I think I really want to talk about Margaret's relationship with her brother.
Sure.
But before we get too far into that, I'd like to go back to the will of her father.
Yes.
Henry VII, and how different his will was to that of Henry VIII in Margaret's role in both of them.
Yes, well, of course, the what turned out 100 years later to be the eventual outcome of this marriage wasn't unforeseen in 1503. It was hoped, of course, that the marriage would bring what was optimistically known as a perpetual peace, which it did for a few years, but not perpetually.
Not so perpetual.
And Henry VII, of course, had recognised that there was possibly a dim and very distant possibility that Margaret's line might succeed in England, in which case, as he quite rightly said, the larger country would probably take over the smaller, and that to a degree is what happened under James VI first. But no, Margaret was certainly not cut out of his will, and though Henry refused to pay her the sums of money that were owed to her, that was a dispute that started early on. He always resented James IV as his brother-in-law. James IV saw Henry as a young, overbearing idiot, basically, I think.
I think many saw him
something like that, yes. And Henry, from time to time, claimed, sovereignty over Scotland, which was a centuries-old dispute. But no, Margaret was recognised in her father's will, and indeed in her brother Arthur's will, though the two had not really known each other very well. Arthur had been off in Ludlow. Royal siblings sometimes met at weddings and major diplomatic events. But while Margaret did grow up with Henry and her younger sister Mary and a couple of other younger children who died, she didn't really know Arthur, but he had left her, if I recall, sort of furnishings and crockery and things like that in his will, and she never got that either because Henry VIII refused to pay it. So she had a legitimate grievance against her brother there, which was exacerbated by this difficult relationship between the kings of the two countries. But of course, Henry VIII cut her line, and she was dead by then, out of his will in 1547, which is a curious thing to have done, because James V, his nephew, who at one stage he had actually said, you said to her, your son may, succeed to the throne of England. The reasoning, of course, is that someone born outside England wasn't legally allowed to succeed.
Okay.
And that is the difference. That was the ostensible reason why Princess Mary Tudor's Brandon descendants were left in the line of descent, but Margaret's were cut out. But I actually think it was just spite, as well. I think there's a large element of that in it. Of course, Margaret had the last laugh.
She did
in the end, because her descendants are still on the throne of the United Kingdom, whereas Henry and his children didn't produce. His children didn't produce a single heir between them. So that is the difference in the two wills. Henry VII was obviously very fond of his daughter. When she parted company with him, never to see him again, of course, in the July of 1503, he gave her a beautiful prayer book in which he inscribed it, "From your loving father," and asked her at all times to pray for him. And Henry VII and Elizabeth of York were very affectionate parents, of course. More than be said for Henry VIII, I think. It took Catherine Parr to remind him pretty much that he had children, actually.
Yes.
That's not quite fair. He had sort of vaguely recognised it beforehand, but not
Vaguely.
to the degree that Henry VII had. So, this sibling rivalry is born early because Margaret was educated with Henry, and although the emphasis of her education would have been somewhat different, they did share some tutors, because Erasmus refers to this and said he'd seen, the royal children and their tutors. So she would have had the best of everything in that respect. And yes, she would have learned embroidery, which Henry obviously didn't. Though incidentally, James IV loved embroidery. He did quite a lot of embroidery. Yes, you can find in the treasurer's accounts orders for silks that he used to. He was a remarkable man, a real polymath, and I presume it was a sort of relaxation. And it probably astonishes people nowadays to think of a warrior king who died in battle sitting around with needle and thread.
Right.
But on the other hand, there wasn't a lot else to do in the evenings in the winter up there, I suppose.
That's interesting.
It's fascinating. You can see, orders for scarlet thread and other colours and all this sort of thing. And he did enjoy embroidering. He may have done knitting as well, I don't know. But men did those sort of things in those days, and it wasn't considered sissy or anything like that. But it's this fascinating insight into a world which seems so remote to us in many respects, but is in others surprisingly accessible, I think. But the rivalry between Margaret and Henry apparently goes back to their childhood. And in one of these annoying things which happens to all historians, that you've read it somewhere, but when you need to be able to find it, you're damned if you can. I know that there is an account somewhere, and probably by a foreign ambassador, which records the fact that Henry resented his elder sister when she became Queen of Scots by her proxy marriage, because she took precedence over him. Whether this is exaggerated or not, I don't know, but there are echoes of it in their relationship subsequently. And it's always astonished me that if he had at all respected her as a person or a politician and not dismissed her as a woman, because while Henry may have wanted constantly to have a wife, he didn't think women were fit to rule. It's true that two of his wives were regents, the Catherines, who bookended his reign, as it were, but they always ruled with a male council to support them. And that was commonplace in those days, but certainly Henry never took any note of Margaret's advice. He might have been willing to use her as a diplomat if it suited him, but he always supported her second husband, the Earl of Angus, against her. And the marriage to Angus was a mistake in retrospect, but Margaret had not long given birth. She was feeling very vulnerable. She couldn't, I think, quite understandably rely on the Scottish lords, no matter what they said. She did have her own supporters, but there was a move early after James IV's death to bring over the Duke of Albany, John Stuart, who was French-born and had never set foot in Scotland and didn't speak any Scots or indeed any English, I don't think. Margaret, of course, would have spoken French. Like everyone in those days, she was certainly fluent in French because well-educated people were, because no one spoke English in the European continent. So you needed to be fluent in foreign languages. I don't know whether she spoke any others. We don't really know, but certainly she would have spoken fluent French. And as the Scottish situation got more complicated, Wolsey and Henry VIII don't ever really seem, between them, have adequately appreciated how they could manage this relationship to their advantage. And the natural inclination was to go with the husband and to view Margaret as someone who, was an irritation rather than anyone they could work with. But had Henry been more open and more respectful and bothered to find out a bit more about the situation in Scottish politics, it is quite possible that a Tudor brother and sister could have quite successfully ruled the whole of the British Isles, and Henry just wasn't interested in this. One of the things I was saying yesterday to another group was that I think the whole area of Henry VIII's foreign policy is sort of largely overlooked, mostly because I suppose it isn't terribly glamorous. It crops up with the field of the cloth of gold and various other things, but basically European kings ran rings around Henry VIII. And this sits ill with people who assume that the Tudors were the best thing since sliced bread. But they weren't, and they weren't that influential in Europe, also perhaps during Elizabeth's reign. But even that was very much affected by religious differences. And of course, successful foreign policies were often very expensive as well. So to some degree, perhaps, holding back made a certain amount of economic sense. But so no, it is a lifelong rivalry, and even one that, as you alluded to earlier on, went on into death, basically, because I'm sure Henry would have been infuriated if he'd known that. I mean, Margaret only had one child that survived. Her son only had one child that survived. And Mary, Queen of Scots, only had one child that survived. But that was sufficient to bring the two crowns together in 1603. And I do finish my book with saying that if we can indulge ourselves just for a moment, as James VI entered Scotland, can imagine the shades of Margaret and James IV walking hand in hand, and the promise of their marriage was ultimately fulfilled.
Yes.
So it's a remarkable story. I mean, Margaret suffered hugely after her husband's death. I mean, there's no indication that she was the hysterical, screaming around Linlithgow Castle type of. I don't think Margaret, she knew how to behave publicly and was very good at that sort of thing, incidentally. And she soon moved her son to safety and established a council that she worked with. But I think she was hampered by her pregnancy as she went along. She attended council meetings well into the early winter, but she gave birth right at the end of April 1515 1514 to her last child with James IV of Scotland, because when James died at Flodden, I think Margaret would probably have known she was pregnant by that time. She wouldn't have known when they took their farewells of each other. She might have suspected, but she wouldn't have known. And only the one child survived. And there were many deaths. We always hear about Catherine of Aragon and all of her difficulties. And Margaret, who was, of course, many years younger, she and James IV lost every child between 1503 and 1512. Their first child, Prince James, who was born with to huge rejoicing, lived only a year. And it is very, very sad, because if you look at the accounts, you can see, how they ordered a magnificent cradle with ribbons and pillows and everything, and a little scarlet satin coat for him. And that's all that we know of him. That's all that's left of him.
So tragic.
It is tragic, yes. And James went on pilgrimage, Margaret went on pilgrimage to pray for a child who would survive. And of course, in the end, she got there before Catherine of Aragon by several years. And they both had, and her son was and her child that survived was a son, not a daughter. So, but there is this other sibling rivalry going on all the time. Who can produce an heir first? But underneath it, there are stories of human suffering and tragedy, which I don't think we recognise well enough.
I think the most tragic part of her story, in my mind, is also the Battle of Flodden.
Yes,
her sister-in-law.
Yes,
being at the helm of that, so to speak. Do we have any idea of how she felt about all of it?
We have indirect comments and things which may be part of folklore. We do know, of course, that Catherine of Aragon, I think perhaps trying to up her own PR with her husband, sent this really extraordinarily unpleasant letter saying that she'd hoped to send James's body, but instead she was sending his bloody surcoat that went over his armour. And she then offered, as an afterthought, to send a friar north to comfort Margaret.
Oh.
And I think Margaret told him to piss off, actually. Well, he never went there, at any rate.
He knew better.
Well, she had friars of her own, thank you very much. This sort of exchange of letters doesn't survive, except, by indirect reference. And I've been asked about this before. Obviously, when Margaret fled down to London for the year, she fled Scotland in the autumn of 1515, gave birth to her only child with Angus, Lady Margaret Douglas, in appallingly difficult circumstances in Harbottle Castle in Northumberland, which was more of a fort than it wasn't the sort of nice comfy home with roaring log fires or anything. And it was a very difficult birth. She had difficult births all the time, except for Alexander, Duke of Ross, who seems to have been born fairly readily, but she nearly died after the birth of her first child. It sounds as though she had puerperal fever, and that killed a lot of women, but not necessarily all of them. And whereas it obviously killed Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr was 36 and Margaret was 17. So, there probably is a difference just in bodily ability to fight these things off, though it may be pure coincidence, I don't know. But she obviously had to get to know her sister. She'd known her, of course, at the time of Arthur's marriage, because Margaret and Mary, the two Tudor princesses, were both present at the marriage, and they met. Elizabeth of York arranged for them to meet Catherine. So they would have known each other. I think it put both of them in a very difficult situation. And what is also interesting, which I would have liked to have gone into more in the book, but we couldn't find documents at the National Archives, and I was helped by people there to look for them. And the problem is that the warrant books, which show what gifts are given to people, are missing for these crucial years in the 1530s. We know that Margaret and Anne Boleyn exchanged gifts, and we know that Margaret seems to have wanted to establish a good relationship with her, which may have been, partly pragmatic, but also suggests that she did for a long period of time. It suggests to me, at any rate, that she did resent Catherine of Aragon.
Interesting.
Yes, whereas, of course, Princess Mary Tudor, Henry's younger sister, didn't get on with Anne Boleyn at all and told her brother forthright that she didn't approve of it. But Margaret didn't go down that route.
I never considered that.
It is an interesting way of looking at it. Yes, Sylvia Barbara Soberton has written an article about this, I think, in the Court Studies magazine. What little documentary evidence survives is quite tantalising, and we did look for more in the National Archives, but we couldn't find it.
It's too bad. There's
It is.
just so
Yeah.
much of this history that we still don't
Don't
know.
have, yeah, that we still don't have, yes. But of course, one of the ways that we know more about people, and even well back into the medieval past, this is, I've been asked before, how do you really find out what these people were like, and how do you represent it? Well, I try not to represent it with a lot of supposition and, wouldn't it have been nice if she'd done this and that, and people sort of clearing their throats and stroking their beards, and I don't go down that route. But one of the things that historians have done in the last sort of 30 years or more, much more than they ever did, is actually look at what these people spent money on. And from that, you can build a picture of their much wider interests. And to some degree, therefore, what they might have been like as individual personalities. And there is quite a lot of stuff in the Scottish treasures. It has volumes and volumes of this stuff. You could dive into it and never come out of it. But there are some fascinating things in there. And that, I think, is how we throw slightly greater light on people who are very distant from us. They're distant from us not just in time, but also in outlook, I think, which is something that's often misunderstood. People are obsessed with the Tudors, and certainly with people like Anne Boleyn. But, and you get people saying, I really have liked to have known her. I don't think you would have, actually. And more to the point, I don't think she would have been interested in knowing you. They lived in a very rarefied world. Queens like Anne Boleyn and Margaret, who were Queen's consort, and even Queens regnant like Mary I and Elizabeth, did they have friends? I'm not sure. They had women that they were close to, undoubtedly, and who they were very reliant on. But I don't think, given their own view of their status, they would necessarily have viewed them as friends. I don't think queens had friends, really.
Just sad.
It is, but it was part of the role you were supposed to play. Other people may take a different view of this. It is certainly true that Elizabeth and Mary, we don't know very much about Margaret's attendants in Scotland, incidentally. She took a whole group of English attendants with her. Her mother had, in the final year of her life, Elizabeth of York, sort of schooled her and trained her in how to manage a royal household, which was one of Margaret's main tasks, of course. James IV paid for most of the household, and we only have a year or so of the accounts which show what Margaret's aspect of this actually was. But, there were roles queens were expected to play. And so, these throw light on the kind of people they were and the roles that they were supposed to have. But really, I think if you look at the queens of that period, it is a tremendous role to aspire to, but it is a lonely one, actually. And even your husband necessarily, you didn't always see that much off. They had different itineraries quite often. The Queen Consort would be expected to go different places and do different things. So in Scotland, one of James IV's first things after his marriage was to take his bride out in a tour of sort of southwest Scotland. I think they may have gone as far north as Perth, if I remember rightly, to show her off to the people, because Stuarts always wanted to be very visible and were sort of touchy-feely kings. You could actually touch. Imagine if anyone had come near Henry VIII like that, he'd probably been executed on the spot. He was very concerned about illness and all that sort of thing, but also he wasn't a touchy-feely king. So there's a big difference there, I think. And so Margaret grew up in this grew to womanhood in a very different environment under the tutelage of a truly charismatic and remarkable man. And his death, as you were saying, at Flodden is tragic. And it put her in a tremendously difficult position. And she never really recovered from it. She spent the whole of the rest of her life trying to recoup what was lost to her, but also to ensure that her little son would survive, even if she had lost control of him. which she gave up in the most wonderfully dramatic circumstances, because Tudors were good at that sort of thing. They really were. Which she issued forth from Stirling, her dower castle, with little James V, who held the keys of the castle, and he surrendered them to the Duke of Albany, the new regent, which is a very dramatic and meaningful gesture. She had a wonderful sense of occasion, I think, Margaret, under those circumstances. And she was, whether her letters, there's a great difference in the interest of many of them, but she was an inveterate letter writer, and this has left us a much more detailed picture of her than a good many other Tudor queens at the time. And of course, she regretted, I think she would have liked, in many respects, to have come back to England again, but Henry wasn't having any of this. He didn't want her there. She cost too much and she was an embarrassment, blah, blah, blah. But towards the end of her life, in fact, in the last year or so of it, she saw Ralph Sadler, who worked for Thomas Cromwell, and who was quite often sent on diplomatic missions to Scotland. He was after Margaret's death, even when Mary Queen of Scots was a baby. And she said, would have been but a small matter to have spent a little pen and ink on me. And which Henry really just couldn't be bothered to do. And so it is a raw and long-standing sibling rivalry, and one which is not adequately appreciated in 16th century history at all, I don't think.
I don't think so either. Well, I have to say, you are one of my favorite historians and authors, and your writing is superb, so I'm going to challenge you right now. If you could describe Margaret in just one word, what would that word be for you?
I'm trying to think, because it's not easy to do this. I think it is determined. And that isn't always a word that has positive connotations. I mean, overall it does, but there are certain negatives perhaps that go with it, but she was determined. Yeah.
I love that. That's a good word for her. Well, I'm here with Dr. Linda Porter. We were just discussing the topic of her new book, The Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor. If people want to get a hold of your book, where can they find one right now?
Well, from the 20th of June, which as we're speaking here now is the day after tomorrow, it's available in both the US and the UK, on Amazon and in bookstores, as far as I know. I'm not quite sure what the distribution arrangement is in the US, I have to say. But it's certainly available on Amazon, Amazon.com, Amazon in the US. And it will be available in Canada and in Europe and essentially wherever you've got a bookstore, hopefully. So there are a lot of us publishing new books at this period at the time, but hopefully people will have enough money to buy mine as well.
Well, save up for this book then. If you don't have the money right now, start saving now, because you will want to get your hands on a copy of this book. It's like nothing that I have read on Margaret Tudor, and I'm very pleased to have had the opportunity to meet you in person and speak with you today. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, for having me. I very much enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy visiting Penshurst Place, where we are at the moment, which is a lovely, stately home, still inhabited by the Sidney family, descendants of Sir Philip. Well, not Sir Philip Sidney personally, but his family, who still live there. And it's a wonderful home in a very attractive part of Kent.
Do you want to be my tour guide?
No, I think not. I'll let you go around by yourself, actually, I think. Have you bought your ticket to go?
I do. It's in my pocket.
Yeah, okay. It's a lovely house. Yeah.
I'm very much looking forward to it. Yeah. Thank you so much, Linda, for being here.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.